Okay, so it is morning. I'm getting my coffee, and I'm going to go over how I tuned my belts on the RatRig V4 300. First thing I found useful, belt turf, or any other belt tensioning tool like the one from West 3D. If you have a belter, make certain you print the tip adapter that they recommend. This gives you a nice flat space for the belts and gets you a better reading value than the default tip that it ships with. So, I got all the belts installed. I got them all to the same tension, fairly low, which was enough to engage the belts and move the gantry around using the belts and check all of the movement values. From there, I needed to know what millimeter value was adequate for the belts. So that's where this little thing comes in. A luggage weight scale, an actual cut of the belt on a clamp. So this allowed me to put a constant 3-pound force and 6-pound force on the belt, and then check the value with the belter. For me, with my belter, the values were 6.25 for 3 pounds, or around 6.25 for 3 pounds. And for 6 pounds, it was 6.8. So the range I was trying to go for my belts, my belter, was between 6.2 and 6.8. There was a YouTube video I watched a while back that recommends for Gates belts to do 6 pounds. So I aimed for 6.8. But before I did that, these were all tuned to 6 pounds so I can engage the gantry. Now for tuning everything, I honed the X and Y axis of the gantry, and then put the gantry moved the gantry all the way to the back. And I'm primarily focusing on, here, let me hold this. I'm primarily focusing on the Y axis first, the 2Y belts first. So what I ended up doing is taking a value at the same point right here on each side. I want to make certain I'm consistent every single time I measure. So I do this outer belt here, and you can see I'm at 6.54 right now for my tuning on this belt, and over here on this belt 6.42. So probably need to adjust that a little bit. I got the belts where I'm happy, basically. They're not perfect, and that's the main thing. So one of the things is I wanted the belts engaged by the motor when I'm tuning, because as the motor moves, the motor is what pulls the belts. So as it moves back or forward, the slack in the belt is going to change from this outer belt, from the outer path to the inner path. So while tuning, I would adjust the Y-axis back and forth by 10 millimeters. So I would move it forward 10 millimeters, measure, adjust, measure, adjust on both sides, then move it back and do the same, back and forth. The values you will get because of that slack moving around will be different on the backstroke versus the upstroke. Also, there's for the belter, you want to make certain that on the belter here, the belts are under the nuts. Not on the nuts, but right under the nuts. Yes, under the nuts. When you're doing your measurement each time. So you do that back and forth enough times until the slack is equal for both the front and back strokes. That gives you a nice starting point. That slack was about 6.5 for me, where I started getting good values on both belts. You can hear you get a nice kind of a bass tune from these. So a very deeper strum for that. And that's how I did the Y belts. Now, on doing the Y belts, when I cut these Y belts, I cut them using this little handy tool mod that someone provided to make certain these were both the same length. Same length is not important. What is important is that the attach points and the bearing points are all identical, left versus right. Now, the way I checked that is once I got my belts tuned to the lower value, which was 6 millimeters, which was 6, before I started tuning the Y-axis, I used a caliper right here to check how tight the value was on both. And there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can check the, trying to record and do this at the same time is annoying. So you can use this method to check up until that screw hole. So left, that is 7.85, right. Here you can see that I am slightly off here, so my belts are just ever so slightly, left and right belts are ever so slightly different lengths to get the same tune. But that also may be because my belter was slightly off on one versus the other. I may need to tighten my belt still a little bit more. But I went into this tuning process with a goal of good enough. And good enough for me was MZV on input shaper with 10K acceleration. That was what I wanted to hit. I didn't need to hit perfect. So, as I mentioned, that was my Y-axis. That's how I did the Y-axis. And I started there, got those to where I was happy with those. For the X-axis, same thing. Now, this is a IDEX, but this can also apply to hybrid and also the basic Core XY. So for IDEX, I bring out my IDEX, push it all the way to the back here using the home screen, and measure the belts. Again, similarly, I measure at the static point here. So I measured at the consistent same point on both sides. Similarly, the motor is what moves the belts, and as you engage the motor and have the motor move right or left, the slack adjusts. So similarly, I moved the X-axis left and right. And so I moved it left, measured, moved right, measured, and adjusted, and then adjusted over and over, and I did that for both. So I switched tool heads and then do the same thing over here. Switch tool heads and do the same thing over here, and just kept going back and forth, moving, wiggling the X-axis as I measured. Once I was happy with the results from the belter and the belts here, I would then go run input shaper. And again, I did the same thing over here. Measured, to make certain that the lengths of my belts were the same. Or at least close enough. When I first did this, even though I cut the belts to the same length and I counted teeth that were engaged here on my y-axis, the offset difference between this y-axis, my right y-axis, and my left y-axis was over 1 millimeter difference. Even though I counted the teeth. And the reason why is because the way this goes is it wraps around inside here and then comes out. That wrapping here and here this one was twisted a little bit more, which made it a little bit tighter than this one. Just enough, and both of these were actually twisted just enough more to make 1 millimeter difference. So I disengaged one tooth, I shortened this, I undid it by one tooth here, and then that got these y-axes within spec of each other. Within like 0.2 millimeters of each other when I measure these values now, which is pretty good. X-axis, thankfully, I didn't have to do anything of that nature. When I engaged the teeth here and on the back, it's just a standard pull and engage teeth method, so counting teeth made that perfectly fine. That was a constant. I didn't have to actually change anything there. Frame was pretty square, so I didn't have to worry about that. So that's how I got my belts set up. The belter was actually, a tension gauge is invaluable. Just by using the tension gauge on the belts, I was able to get the tension perfect for the, set up identical for all my belts. And Input Shaper was spitting out MZV for everything at 10K acceleration. Or more, actually. I think some were up to almost 18K, some values. I'll have to look at my Input Shaper. So that is how I tune the belts. Next video is going to be how I did my visual assist and walk you through those steps. Bye-bye.